The Castle of the Eternal Curse. Chapter 1. The Call of the Walls. Sara Vanderfort knew that life was rarely easy. As the eldest daughter of a farming family, she had learned to take on responsibility early. But nothing could have prepared her for the dark atmosphere in Blackwood Castle. She had been working there for months in a remote, decaying castle deep in the old English forest. With her blonde hair and quiet confidence, she stood out among the other maids, but it was her determination that kept her in this grim place. There were rumors about the castle, about eerie things hidden deep underground, about people who disappeared. Sara didn't want to believe it. At least she tried. But in the last few weeks, 3 maids and a stable boy had mysteriously died. Their bodies were found as if they had fallen, but Sara knew there had to be more to it. The castle had secrets. Sara felt it in every fiber of her being. Chapter 2. The Missing Stable Boy. That morning, the mood in the castle was even more oppressive than usual. The stable boy was missing. No note, no trace, simply gone. Sara heard the others whispering as she passed by the kitchen entrance. She heard her name and knew that some of them would soon be leaving the castle. But Sara couldn't just leave. "It's this castle," murmured Thomas, the young cook, as she met him by the large fireplace. "It changes people, makes them sick." Sara looked at him curiously. "What do you mean by that?" Thomas glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening. "You've felt it too, haven't you? Something's not right here. The old walls. They hold more than just memories." Sara nodded slowly. She had felt it for a long time, and now it was time to find the truth. Chapter 3. The Dungeon. Sara knew that the key to all the strange events had to lie in the castle's basement. There were rumors among the staff about an old dungeon deep underground, where prisoners had once been tortured. No one spoke of it, but Sara had long since decided to find the truth. That night, she made her way down. With a candle in hand and a firm resolve, she crept through the castle's grim corridors. The way to the basement was hidden, but Thomas had told her where to find the secret door. She found it behind an old tapestry, concealed from prying eyes. The basement was damp and cold, and the smell of decay hung heavily in the air. The stone steps led down into the depths, and with each step, the silence grew more oppressive. Sara knew she was in danger, but she couldn't turn back. Not now. Chapter 4. The Screams in the Dark. As Sara reached the bottom of the basement, she heard it, a faint, muffled whisper, as if seeping through the walls. It seemed to be calling to her. She followed the whisper through the dark corridors, past rusted iron gates and crumbling cells. It was as if the walls themselves were coming alive. Suddenly, a scream, a loud, agonizing moan that made her freeze. It sounded human, but at the same time, inhuman. Sara gathered all her courage and followed the sound deeper into the catacombs. Her heart pounded wildly, but she knew she had to find the truth. Then, at the end of a long corridor, she saw it. An old cell, so deep in the darkness that she almost missed it. And there, in the gloom, she saw movement. Chapter 5. The Horror Revealed. Sara stepped closer, her candle trembling in her hand. Something, or someone, was moving in the cell. She could barely make out what it was, but the air around her seemed to grow heavier, as if the room had suddenly drained all hope. Then it stepped into the light. A creature, twisted and misshapen, that must have once been human, but no longer was. Its body was emaciated, its skin grey and cracked, its eyes black as coal. Sara instinctively stepped back, but the creature just stared at her, as if it wasn't truly seeing her, but looking right through her. It opened its mouth, but no words came out, only a faint, hollow wheeze that cut through the air. The creature began to move, slowly, shuffling, as if its limbs were held together by a last thread of will. Sara knew she had to act fast. Her heart raced as the creature suddenly lunged at her. With a quick step, she backed away, stumbled, and nearly fell to the ground. Her candle dropped from her hand and went out. Darkness surrounded her. She could hear the creature's breath, heavy and ominous. But then, a thought flashed in her mind. She remembered the iron gate she had passed earlier. In a desperate attempt, she turned and ran. Her hands fumbled in the darkness for the gate until she felt the cold, rusty metal. She flung the gate open and closed it just in time as the creature slammed against the bars. For a moment, she stood there panting, the creature snarling and banging against the door, but she was safe, at least for the moment. Chapter 6: The Old Rituals. With trembling hands and a pounding heart, Sara returned to Thomas the next day. She told him about the creature, about what she had seen in the dungeon. Thomas looked at her with wide eyes before nodding determinedly. "We have to end this, Sara. If it's truly a curse, then there's a way to break it." Together, they searched the castle's old archives for clues. Hours passed, and the light of the sun faded as they finally found something. An ancient scroll, yellowed and nearly illegible, spoke of an old ritual. It was a curse placed upon the castle, a curse that bound the dead to the castle to torment them forever. "The souls of those who die here are not freed," Sara whispered as she read the words. "They are doomed to remain here until the curse is broken." But the ritual was dangerous. It required the blood of the living and the heart of the dead, symbols of the powers of life and death. Chapter 7: The Final Battle. The night was dark and still as Sara and Thomas set out to perform the ritual. The old writings had shown them the way, but the danger was greater than they had imagined. The creatures of the castle had awakened. They lurked in the shadows, their eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. "We can't give up," Thomas whispered as they crept through the catacombs. "There's no other way." Sara knew he was right, but her heart raced with fear. She could feel the darkness closing in around them, as if the castle itself was working against them. But she was determined. When they reached the altar where the ritual was to take place, the walls began to tremble. The creatures came closer, and Sara knew their time was running out. "Start," she told Thomas, her voice firm despite the fear raging inside her. Thomas spoke the old words he had found in the writings. The air seemed to vibrate as the ritual took its course. The creatures writhed as if invisible forces were forcing them to their knees, but they fought on. Sara knew it wouldn't be enough. The curse was stronger than expected. With one final desperate breath, Sara stepped forward and grabbed the knife Thomas had placed on the altar. The curse demanded the sacrifice of a living person, and in that moment, she knew she had no other choice. "No!" Thomas shouted as he realized what Sara was about to do. But she only shook her head. "It has to be done," she whispered as she placed the blade against her hand. With a sharp cut, she let her blood drip onto the altar. The air around them began to change, to vibrate, as the blood touched the cold stone. The ritual seemed to awaken in that moment. But then, without warning, The ground beneath them trembled. The creatures screamed, a bone-chilling, inhuman sound that filled the room and made the air tremble. They charged toward the altar as if trying to stop the ritual. Their distorted faces were filled with hatred and despair, and their movements became faster and more brutal. Sara could feel the breath of the creatures as they approached. Her heart raced, but she remained resolute. With a swift movement, she grabbed the heart of the deceased they had prepared and placed it on the altar, while Thomas spoke the final words of the ritual. The room began to roar, as if the walls themselves were fighting against the darkness that had held them captive for centuries. A sharp wind swept over Sara and Thomas, pulling at their clothes and causing their candle flames to flicker wildly. The creatures screamed and writhed, but they couldn't escape the ritual. Slowly, painfully slowly, they began to disappear, their bodies dissolving as if they were evaporating into the air. The darkness that had hung over the castle for so long receded. It felt as though the castle was finally taking a breath, freed from the curse that had haunted it for generations. Chapter 8. The High Price continued. Sara knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. She could feel the exhaustion creeping into her body, but she knew she had to keep going. "You did it," she said softly, trying to smile, but inside she felt the weight of loss. Thomas looked at her, and in his eyes there was a mix of relief and sorrow. We did it," he whispered, closing his eyes. Sara sat silently beside him for a while. She felt that the darkness in the castle had lifted, but a part of it would stay with her forever. The ritual had freed the castle, but Sara knew it would never truly let her go. The memories of the creatures, the whispers of the walls, and the eerie presence would always stay with her. Chapter 9. The New Silence of the Castle. The next morning, the castle was quiet. Too quiet. The shadows that had always hidden in the corners seemed to have vanished, and the walls, which had constantly whispered, were silent. The castle was freed from its curse, but it was also emptied of life. Sara wandered through the empty halls, feeling the void left behind by the ritual. The staff had left, many out of fear, and the few who had stayed knew the castle would never be the same again. She stepped onto the balcony and gazed out over the forest. The mist that had always surrounded the castle seemed to be dissolving. Sunbeams shone through the treetops, bathing the world in golden light. But Sara felt nothing. The price of freeing the castle had been too high, and she knew she could never leave this place. The castle was now free, but Sara was bound to this place in a way she couldn't explain. She had become part of the curse. Chapter 10. A New Chapter. Weeks passed, and the castle stood still. The villagers had started avoiding it again, fearing the stories that still whispered around the walls. They spoke of a woman who had stayed behind, the last witness to the horrors that had taken place there. Sara herself had withdrawn. She lived alone in the castle, which was now quiet and peaceful, but in the deep corners and hidden catacombs, she knew that something hadn't completely disappeared. The curse may have been broken, but darkness always leaves its mark. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, Sara thought she could hear the faint whispers of the walls again, a weak echo of what had once been. And she knew that she would forever be a part of this old, cursed castle.